Good evening. Thank you for the invitation to come here. I appreciate Kirk thinking about our new program at the Department of Natural Resources and thinking it might be of interest to you all. I hope you find it interesting. So I'm Stephen Shine. I'm a relatively new recruit to the DNR. I spent a career of 28 years at the Michigan Department of Agriculture, and then when the opportunity to take this program on came along, I jumped at it, and it's been a lot of fun the last couple of years. So I spent the first half of my career draining wetlands. I spent working with drain commissioners, draining wetlands to protect land property from flooding and whatnot, and for agricultural production. And then the second part of my career I was spending doing conservation work, habitat restoration, wetland restoration, that kind of thing. So this was a nice fit for something that I was very interested in and wanted to take advantage of. So I'm going to do the who, what, where, when, and why approach to presentations. And there he is.
Howdy.
Hey, how are we doing? Just getting started, so you haven't missed much.
Perfect. Yeah, Steve just introduced himself.
Yeah. So the who. So like I said, I work for the Michigan DNR, but we are working very closely with our sister agencies being the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environmental Quality. The Department of Environmental Quality is the regulatory entity, so all of our work gets filtered through them and approved by them, and then ultimately up to the EPA and the Corps. So they're very important to us as far as a good partner and helps us keep on the straight and narrow. There are many moving parts in this program and in the law and so on and so forth. So they help us out tremendously. And then of course the Department of Ag is very interested in agricultural production, and the blueberry growers, and then the standard fare agricultural production requires drainage for it to be successful. You may not know, but Michigan's agricultural industry is the second largest sector of our economy, bar none. So it's pretty important. And then we work very closely with this group called the Michigan Municipal Wetland Alliance. It's a 501c3, so it's a nonprofit entity. And then it's governed by a representative from the Michigan County Road Association, County Drainage Commissioners Association, Association of Counties, Michigan Townships Association, and Michigan Municipal League. So because their members ultimately would be potential customers for the credits that we will generate, they're helping us to steer this boat forward, and they've been very important to making things work. Mr. Lindeman, imagine that.
Hey, Steve. All right.
I'm good.
Good to see you.
I was just telling them that I started the first half of my career draining wetlands, and the second half making up for all those deeds that I did. So basically, mitigation, the word is pretty obvious to everyone. The wetland mitigation is to make up for impacts to wetlands. So the kinds of projects that we're thinking of are, for drain commissioners, obviously drain projects, road commissioners, road projects. Municipal projects are all over the board. There's just recently talked to an entity about a soccer field that was going to be, the corner of it was going to be in a wetland, had to mitigate its impact. So it could be schools, prisons, you name it. Then blueberry growers, I kind of briefly mentioned that blueberries are grown in organic soils with low pH, typically are wetland soils, so the wetlands are drained and cleared for blueberry production. So when they do that, they need to mitigate their impact. It's a complicated thing for them, but basically we are making our credits available to them as they need them. And they're buying them, so there's no freebies, everybody's buying them. And then the other part of our program, so we have a two-pronged part of our program. It is for agricultural production, and under the federal farm bill it's called a swamp buster violation. So the federal farm bill 1985, first time that wetland compliance was attached to participation in federal farm bill programs. So if you're out of compliance with the farm bill, you got to pay the piper, which is USDA, and they either hold money back or penalize you for repayment of money that you may have received from them. So wetland restoration or wetland mitigation banking is replacing those wetland functions and values. So we talk about functions and values. So functions are flood storage, groundwater regeneration, water purification or water quality, and then the values are all the esoteric values that we derive from birds and flora and fauna and those kinds of things that are really important. And so when you look at a wetland, there's an actual very complicated process that they do, a functional assessment, so functions and values are evaluated. And then on a wetland mitigation bank site, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second, but basically we find a piece of ground that once upon a time was a wetland. It was drained at some point to be farmland or whatever, and then you can restore the hydrology and make it a wetland again. So each acre that you restore is a credit, and each credit has value, and those credits are transacted to offset a project that someone's doing, like maybe a township like Meridian. And then they buy those credits and they offset their impact, and all is good with the world.
Actually, he didn't drain them, he enhanced them.
Yeah, right. So our focus initially is on our state-owned land because we, as I was saying in the beginning, actually when Governor Snyder first went to whatever the big shindig is up on Mackinac Island for all the legislators and so on, he said he's very proud to know that we own so much land. But then he said, but why do we own so much land and what are we doing? What's the value? And he was kind of setting up a little bit of a conversation. But so he was very interested in us using our state-owned land resources and restoring the hydrology on those resources where we can to generate these wetland mitigation bank credits. So that's our initial focus is on those state-owned lands that have hydric soils. We're enhancing recreational opportunities on those state-owned lands, so there's a lot of hunting opportunity for waterfowl and other game birds on wetland habitat types. And then there's all kinds of dicky birds and other things that people like to look at that are benefited from it, having a wetland habitat in their vicinity. And then we're doing it across the state, and we're doing it in advance of some of the projects that we expect will need the credits. So we tried to distribute our first 4 project sites on state-owned lands across. It's not intentional, but it's kind of knuckles down because that's where we anticipated the most economic activity to occur. So we have one at Allegan, one at south of Ionia, one over by Breckenridge, and then one over in Petersburg down by Dundee. So, and then I just like this slide because I think it's pretty cool. These guys are as proud as punch that they accomplished this big project with this dredge. And for if you've lived in Michigan all your life, you know that Michigan was in the books kind of a godforsaken, mosquito-infested swamp. It wasn't worth investing in the survey of it. And then, but over time, with the drainage being put in place, all of a sudden we had a real gem, as we all know and love this great state. But that's what it took to do. So it's not, I think it's kind of cool, but it's not pretty to some people, and it's pretty dramatic, but it changed the landscape. And as you know, some of the first ditches were made to build the roads, and then more ditches are made for farming and habitation and all those kinds of things.
The value of the soils underneath the swamps.
Yes.
You could grow more onions per acre.
Onions and radish.
Dried out swamps more
Yeah.
than you could on upland areas.
Horseradish and everything else. So the goal is to replace wetland functions that provide public benefits, and I mentioned this before: flood storage, water quality protection, fish and wildlife habitat, and groundwater recharge. Wetlands are very unique in that regard because they're plumbed in with the groundwater for that purpose. And so I mentioned that part of what we're doing is this federal farm bill connection, so I wanted to address this real briefly. So under the federal farm bill, if you're in violation of the farm bill and under the swamp buster provision, you lose your program benefits. And then, so there's nearly 600 wetland violations across Michigan, as mostly in the southern part, and that represents about 1,700 acres of land converted for these little wetlands that are on the middle of farm fields that farmers converted. And then if they're out of compliance, it's pretty important to farmers, they have federal crop insurance at all. And then there's a federal crop insurance subsidy that really helps. It's about 55 or 60% of the premium cost is a subsidy. So having access to that subsidy is really important. So they're pretty motivated to try to get back into compliance where the possibility exists. And then access to the federal farm bill financial programs for conservation work as well. So just a little bit more on that. So they have choices, which choices are always good. So you can, if you're the farmer that converted this wetland, you can restore that site. You can mitigate the site that you converted somewhere else on your farm, which sometimes is attractive because it's out of the way. They'll do it on a corner of a field. Then you can purchase credits from a bank like us to offset the impacts. And then there's a good faith status thing, which is kind of a goofy thing, but you can basically get in a good faith status with the feds, and that helps you maintain your access to these programs and allows you some time to get things straightened around and fixed.
How long does that last? How many times can
1
you
year.
claim good faith? Okay.
You got the violation, you get 1 year good faith status to fix it, so you can restore it by mitigation credits, whatever those choices you make. But you have 1 year to get it done, which is, it burns up pretty quick. So the Federal Clean Water Act is what this all happens under. That was passed in 1972, which is pretty amazing. That's that long ago. There's still cities that are out of compliance with the basic parts of this.
Vetoed by Nixon. Overread by Congress, and we had to sign it.
Yeah.
They overrode his veto.
So it's that long ago. And then I was mentioning that only recently, like a decade ago, did this whole mitigation banking thing start to get rolling, because initially, as you know, in this township, you're legendary for your protecting every square inch of wetland. They kind of decided that, maybe it's better to give up a lower quality wetland that's in the middle of some proposed project and focus on a high quality, high functioning wetland somewhere where it's wanted and somewhere where it will be permanently protected. That's the key, that it's, all these mitigation bank sites there was a conservation easement placed on them, so they're permanently protected, and the holder of the easement is the DEQ, so you give up that land right. And then when you convert a wetland, so there's many types of wetlands, but they kind of boil down for this purpose of this program to wooded, shrub, and emergent. And emergent is probably the one that most people can visualize the easiest, because it's cattails and open water and whatnot. But depending on which wetland you convert, you may, if you converted 1 acre of wooded, you may be required to mitigate 2 acres of wooded. So that's the George Bush Sr. thing, where no net loss of wetlands. So instead of just 1 for 1, you're actually gaining over time by mitigating those impacts. And then you typically would mitigate like for like. So if you impact a wooded wetland, you mitigate a wooded wetland. So you don't. And then, but sometimes in some schemes there are opportunities to mitigate with not like. So you can out of kind. And so if you converted an acre of emergent, but an acre of wooded, but there's not wooded acres available, you may get by 2 or 3 credits of emergent to make things square. The regulatory agency kind of manages that. Out of kind, that's what it's called, out of kind. So I mentioned this nonprofit entity that I work with very closely. We have received money from the state treasury to the DNR, and then DNR granted it to this Michigan Municipal Wetland Alliance. It was kind of all kind of constructed as they put the budget bill together. So DNR's role is that we hold conservation easements on private land when we do that for Swamp Buster. We manage and maintain the bank sites over time. That's another important part of these. All these restored wetlands are monitored and maintained very intensely for the first 5 years, because that's when they're most vulnerable to get reestablished. And then annually beyond that, following a very strict protocol for walking transects and stopping at quadrats and drawing a circle and counting the plants and the whole 9 yards. So it's pretty important that not only is the hydrology maintained, but that the plant communities that were expected to be restored are established and are maintained as well. And so sometimes they construct them on, we do it on public and private. It's obviously more desirable when you already own the land and you control it, you can restore it, but we've also found some wetland restoration sites on private land as well. So again, the Swamp Buster thing that you may or may not be so interested in, but it's pretty important to many people in the state, that these credits they're transacted just like a bank account. So for the bank site, it has a name. So we have one called the Potato Creek. The Potato Creek will have 60 credits. They're in the account. If you need to buy credits from that account, you need wooded, shrub, or emergent, you check it off. Then there's a transaction record that goes between the Michigan Municipal Wetland Alliance, the DEQ, and the buyer of the credits. And then for the federal farm bill stuff, on their land use map that they own, that the feds keep track of, a converted wetland is changed to a mitigated wetland, so in perpetuity going forward. That's kind of important. So on these sites that we're restoring on private land, we're placing easements on them. So we're buying a conservation easement from a private landowner who wants to have a wetland on their land. We're paying $2,500 to $3,500 an acre. We hired a firm out of Cairo, Michigan, to do an appraisal of farmland across the state, and that's the range that they gave us for an easement. Funny thing is, the farmers don't think it's a very good deal, but it's what the appraisal came out to be. So, services bank sponsor, coordinate construction. It's a public-private partnership, which is a great thing for us because it makes it a lot easier to navigate all the soliciting bids and awarding contracts and whatnot. So we have hired professional engineering firms, construction firms, wetland biologists, and the whole slew of professionals that do this kind of work for us to help set up and design the sites. And that's worked out really well. And then on the back end of it, once the site is restored, the long-term monitoring and maintenance will be completed by DNR staff on our land. And then, but there's in each account for each bank, there's money set aside to do the long-term monitoring and maintenance. So it's not coming out of a new pot of money. So you can set aside some of the money from the sale of the credits as you go. And then you set aside a little bit on the front end too. And then you have money to do that long-term monitoring maintenance, because the biggest challenge ends up being, imagine this, invasive species. That they are a nightmare. I almost said the wrong word. Quite a nightmare. Phragmites is terrible. Autumn olive, all these vines. I mean, it's just a slew of things that we're under constant siege. So, reed canary grass, the bane of I was out on
The MSU professor that brought it to the United States.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, really?
We were looking at a 100-acre site down by Coldwater today. The restoration potential is fantastic, but it's solid reed canary grass.
You have to kill it all too.
We're gonna have to nuke it a couple times.
It's gotta die. The roots gotta go away.
Yeah. So, but that's in our long-term monitoring maintenance. That's the reality that we're dealing with. So the little important part here too is that the converted wetland or the impacted wetland and the restored site had to be in the same watershed. So these are Michigan's watersheds. We weren't ignoring the UP. J.R. Richards would kill me, but it's just the reality. Most of our activity is down here. So a converted wetland and the mitigated wetland have to be in the same watershed, and that's a trick. So we have. And can you see those stars on there very well? Those are the sites that I was referring to earlier. So there's one over here in Allegan, the Allegan State Game Area by Fenville. There's one here south of Ionia at the Grand River State Game Area. This is Gratiot Saginaw State Game Area at south of Breckenridge. And then there's one down here by Dundee. Those are our first 4 state game area sites. And we did that thinking that the distribution is good, and whenever we need the credits, it might help us out. And then the extra bonus part of this whole equation is something called an ecoregion. You know what an ecoregion is, Pat?
Yeah, I hate those.
I do too. I keep the definition on my iPhone just so I can read it off to you, but it's basically a landscape of similar type that someone drew a line on the map, and that's what we're stuck with. The good thing is that, as you can see, so this one over here was intended to be primarily, or not exclusively, but primarily for blueberry producers, and that's where a lot of blueberry production occurs. So that ecoregion there. This Grand River site is in this gigantic ecoregion, so that covers a lot of counties. So we've got Clinton, we've got Ingham, Eaton, Livingston, so there's a lot of potential there. And then Potato Creek is in this ecoregion, and then the Petersburg site is this ecoregion, which is obviously a hotbed of economic activity and all the development down there. So we think between the 2 maps and the 2 things that are in play that we have things pretty well covered here. It's all front loaded, so we're kind of guessing, because we actually went to the counties and the townships and municipalities and said, what projects do you have on the books, and where might you need credits? And they're like, we don't know. So that's fine. Well, we just did this to try to get ahead of the curve, and we want to have credits available so when you have a project, you don't have to slam on the brakes because you are going to impact a wetland and you have to go through that whole process. If we have credits available, you still have to work through the DEQ, You apply for a permit, you demonstrate that you've avoided first, minimized second, and if you can't do the first two things and you have to impact a wetland, then you mitigate it. And that's when, if the credits are available, you're good to go.
So I'm not quite sure I understand the distinction between eco-regions and the watersheds in terms of choosing where you mitigate, how the mitigation relates to the original.
So for the purpose of where you establish the bank and where you converted the wetland, so if you're doing a project that's going to convert the wetland, if the conversion and the bank are in either the watershed, the same watershed, or the same ecoregion,
I see, okay.
they count.
Whichever is easier.
Yeah, well, they prefer, and intuitively, I kind of go along with this, they prefer the wetland, the watershed, because it makes a little bit more sense scientifically, but the ecoregion's in play, so we'll take advantage of that if we need to. So this is just a little bit of the swamp buster stuff because I think it's important, and I just want to share it with you. Is that so? I've lived here all my life, and I've worked here all my life, and I kind of thought I had an idea where most of the wetland conversions might have occurred. You know, I was thinking Saginaw Bay, I was thinking South River Raisin, and the federal agencies, USDA agencies, Farm Services Agency, and Natural Resources Conservation Service, they're held to these really strict confidentiality rules. And even though we got $1 million grant from USDA and RCS, they wouldn't tell us where the conversions were because they're confidentiality rules. They didn't, trust us. So we went around and around and around, and I don't give up very easy, and I didn't give up, but I just kept on pestering them because I said, how about if you contact him? How about if I write a letter and you mail it? And, all this. Well, finally, with the change of administration, someone who was a little bit more open to thinking what we're trying to get done listened to us and said, at least we can do is provide you these maps of Michigan, color code the watersheds based on the density of the violations or the conversions. So now all of a sudden we have these maps. So for the swamp buster violations, we have a better idea where we should be spending our time. And the maps that I showed you with the gold stars, those are primarily for municipal projects. And now we have 5 sites that we've identified for these swamp buster sites, and we have some confidence that we're in the right place because there will be a market potentially if the farmers want to buy the credits, but at least we know that there are converted wetlands and farmers that need the credits. So the thing that was a surprise to me is that this is the St. Joe. This is the Kalamazoo. This is the headwaters of the Grand. And this is the that's the Shiawassee. That's the Cass, I think. So we have a better idea where we should be spending our time, so that's pretty helpful. And this other map just shows you, so the first map was the number of violations, which they call it occurrences. And this map here shows you the acres, so it doesn't really change a lot, but it's just kind of interesting. So we have more confidence that we're in the right place. And so right now we have a bank site that we're working on in the Muskegon River watershed, which is here. That's pretty close to being approved. We have one in the Lower Grand, which is here. We have one in the Maple, which is, I think it's one of these. Let's do that one there. And we have one in the River Raisin down here, and then one in the St. Joe. So we have, yes, sir.
We got a couple minutes before we need to get into the Q&A section.
Okay, I'm right to the end right now.
Okay.
So, see a lot of this in the springtime. Farm field with water standing in it. Without tile drainage, it would be a wetland, right? There's tile drainage under that. The water goes away in fairly short order, goes back to ag production. So these are the kind of sites, though, that we're looking for because with the tile drainage in there, we have the potential of breaking the tile, blocking the tile, creating the flooding, and then planting the wetland plants, and away you go. You got a wetland again. And this is just an example of a site that we are doing. It's called the Gratiot-Saginaw State Game Area. So there's a county drain that goes along this edge of it. So all the water goes off of it into the drain. There's a ditch and some drain tile that take the water away. So low head berm, some shallow push-outs, sculpting, berm around here, and it'll fill up with water. Road ditch comes down here, we'll catch that water too. So that site is currently a farm field, it's a cornfield, and we're gonna make it a wetland again. Something along the lines of this. We've done a lot of them. The ones along 127 are the early early projects that are nice to have them in your backyard. They're pretty, but they're not as high quality and functional as you want. And then at DNR, we put a high mark on the recreational opportunities and the economic impact or opportunity that comes along with those. So that's me and my 2 dogs in the middle, but all those pheasants were wild pheasants, so they weren't pen raised and put and take or none of that. They were all shot off of a restored wetland on a farm field up by Bay City. And so we get to go up there once or twice a year, and I always like to point out that, so a tank of gas, shotgun shells, because we miss a lot, and then we always go out for lunch at the local diner, so it has that, that economic contribution. And then, they're doing a lot of networking. The people in the picture there are, getting a lot of work done and talking to each other and solving problems. So that's my presentation. I'm glad to talk about anything in between. I tried to give you a little bit what we're doing and why, but I'm glad to talk to you. I was mentioning a little bit. Do I have to hold on to this still? I was mentioning a little bit. There are opportunities for you as a township if you wanted to, pursue it, or even with the drain commissioner if he wanted to work with you on something. So if you have a piece of real estate that you currently own that's open, that had the hydrology taken away for whatever reason, someplace back in time, you could conceivably obstruct the drainage infrastructure, flood it again, you'd have a wetland. You could conceivably sell the credits to offset someone else's impacts and generate some revenue. I recently attended a conference, a national conference, and learned, I was shocked, quite honestly, that the amount of private capital across the country that's invested in these mitigation banks, not just wetlands, but a lot of it's wetlands, but there's all kinds of other habitat, stream restoration banks, and the return on investment is 18 to 20%. These are hedge fund guys that were talking. That was like mind-boggling. And the credits in Michigan and the private side go from $90,000 to $110,000 an acre. And then out east, they're like $300,000 to $400,000 an acre. It's crazy. But they have less real estate to monkey around with, so I guess real estate's real estate. It's all about location, right? So, any questions? Any thoughts? Yes, sir.
I'm confused enough here, trying to put together the fact that you used to be, I guess, a swamp buster.
Saw the light.
What?
I saw the light.
How historic are the violations? Now, I heard you say 1 year, 2 year. But
So-
what about something that you helped drain 20 or 30 years ago?
So it goes back to the 1985 Farm Bill for the Farm Bill conversions. That's what I'll answer the question on that one first. So the 1985 Farm Bill was the first time in history where wetland compliance was attached to participation in federal Farm Bill programs. So,
And that came out of the Federal Clean Water Act.
well, well, kind of, but not.
That's where the regulation came from.
Well, there's like a firewall between USDA and the EPA though, but I mean, you're essentially absolutely right because the Federal Clean Water Act, Section 404, has everything to do with wetland conversions, but they didn't catch up to agriculture in a meaningful way until 85.
That's right.
And then from 85 forward, so, I mean, it's kind of comical really if you think about it because prior to 85, the USDA, NRCS provide financial assistance to farmers to drain farmland. And then someone figured out that maybe we shouldn't be doing that anymore. So if your conversion had occurred prior to 85, you're good to go going forward. But if your conversion happened after 85, that's where the clock starts for that violation. And the funny thing is, and it's all funny with the federal government, but, and I mean that in the best way, but
Sure.
they didn't really ratchet down on anybody until, because there's a new farm bill every 5 years. So 85, in 91, they don't do it on 5-year cycles, even though they're supposed to. 96, and it keeps on going. So every new farm bill, they ratcheted it down a little tighter. And in about 2012 or 2014, they really clamped down. And all of a sudden, they sent out all these letters to farmers who they had documentation that they were out of compliance. So as I said earlier, there's like 600 of them and 1,700 acres. So each farmer, all of a sudden, from the date of their violation, when they converted it, to the date they're notified, they may have been receiving some federal payments. So that dollar amount they owe back until they come back into
The
compliance.
violation was after that 85.
Yes. So there's that gap between the conversion and the notification, that's one part of it. And then you're ineligible for participation in the Farm Bill programs, which is, to some farmers, they say, well, I don't really want to do those conservation programs anyways. But in 2014, all of a sudden, your access to the federal crop insurance subsidy, which is 60% of the premium, goes away if you're out of compliance. That's a biggie, because not many people can farm and not have that safety net. That make sense?
Kind of.
I didn't make the rules, I'm just telling you what they are.
If we can focus on a couple of places where this group, our environmental commission, might plug in. We basically have, I think, two. First is applicants who come to us because they have a project that may involve disturbing a wetland, and they're looking for mitigation. And the possibility of each applicant having to go and arrange that for themselves seems like inefficient, and there may be opportunities for streamlining that process for the applicant. So figuring out how we can connect on that level is one. And the other is a land preservation program that's funded by a millage where we purchase land, some of which perhaps we could do some banking of our own.
Right.
So
On the first part, the first idea, so that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing, because we figured out, we thought that it'd be better to have us kind of get ahead of the curve and just restore some sites and have credits available to you all as public corporations or public entities that are doing projects. Now, if you as a township could find a site in your township, or first of all, you can help landowners connect to readily available mitigation credits. There's a registry on the DEQ's website, and it identifies what watershed and what ecoregion the bank covers, and then they can contact that private entity and make arrangements to buy credits. So, I mean, I'm not going to say anything about your wetland ordinance or anything like that, but it is a way to move forward instead of fighting and spending a lot of money fighting.
And is the applicant likely to see a cost benefit to purchasing a credit rather than trying to go and engineer their own?
Yes,
You
absolutely.
believe that's going to be a significant
It's
difference
huge.
for them?
Yes.
Sorry.
Go.
How can you replace the value of the functional value of a wetland on a property here in another area? I mean, doesn't it play a crucial role in the water management at the local level?
In a way, yes, but the idea is, the science is that if it's in the same watershed, you're getting the benefit in the same watershed. But, I mean.
But the watershed, I mean, those are huge areas, right? The watersheds?
Yes, they're large.
So I think the difference there is, if we as a township want to maintain that within our township, or, are we willing to lose a wetland here in our township and the credits somewhere else, where we've kind of lost that benefit from a very local perspective, but it's a good.
Yeah, because that is kind of the angle you could do. You could restore a site in your township and have credits readily available for activities that would occur in your township, and then direct people to that.
But it's going to be a lot more expensive for us to do that than you guys who are doing it on a big scale.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think there are some very good consulting firms that would be helpful to you. That if you had a piece of real estate, I kind of know the township a little bit, but there's places around there still some open land. And I was looking at, the DEQ has a wetland viewer thing. Have you looked at it? And you can see where they were. There's some places that, like the mall, it used to be one, that's not anymore, obviously. But then there's other places that still have the potential for being restored. And I think you may even own some of them. So you could conceivably set up a wetland mitigation bank on your land, and then direct persons who are applying to mitigate or needing to mitigate activities to your site, and then they charge them accordingly. And the market's, the market, so 90 to 110 on the private side. Ours are 30,000 to sell to you if you were doing a project, and to the farmers it's 10,000 an acre. But that is something that you could do, and it would be kind of a slick thing. I know there is a drain commissioner in Southwest Michigan that did a project that she did a wetland mitigation bank site to offset the activities on a project that she was doing, and then she made credits available to other public works projects in her county. And, you know, and they're only 45,000, still a lot of money.
Pat raised his hand first.
John Engler really pushed banking heavy when he was governor. And I wrote a letter to John responding to his request for public input. And wasn't very kind. It was like a 3-page letter. And
You wrote a letter that wasn't very kind?
it's hard to navigate. But John and I didn't get along very well. But the whole, I do not support banking at all. I'm more of a purist. If you have a wetland, it's worth saving. And replacing a wetland here with something 50 miles away, I have to ask a series of questions. How does the salamander and the frog, what do you buy bus tickets to ship them to where you want to put
There's
them?
winners and losers and everything.
I know there is. And my last comment in that letter was that wetland banking is akin to swapping a Monet for a Velvet Elvis. And you already have a jewel in your community. Why would you even think of getting rid of it and allowing other people to destroy something? In the end, your community loses, becomes more concrete, and water management becomes more difficult, and so on and so forth. I see wetland banking as not a solution, although it has some benefit factors to it. I mean, it's replacing a lot of wetlands which were destroyed. A farmer retires and he floods his field and he moves on to Florida. His kids don't want to farm anymore, so his land becomes an asset,
Sure.
an environmental asset. He refloods it. We've done that several times here. I've done it with the DNR down in the Dansville game area.
Right.
We flooded a huge area and reclaimed it as wetland functionalities. But in general, banking, in my opinion, is not a good idea. Although the state keeps pushing it, and probably Whitmer isn't going to push it if she becomes governor. I've had a conversation with her about it.
Good.
Not to rain on your parade, but
Well,
But if you're
you're-
creating a bank in your community, aren't you achieving kind of your goal at the same time?
I think you're playing, look, when the glaciers left this stuff here, and you try to manipulate it, you declare war on this water, water's gonna always win. And you're gonna wind up putting properties in sensitive areas where they don't belong. I mean, what right does the Lansing Mall have to be on that marsh? Your Okemos School is built in a wetland, its foundation's sinking. I mean, it's not, regardless of how much fill you put in and how you engineer something, it's still a wetland. And you want the subdivisions to go in and destroy the natural beauty of something or the natural functionality. 1 acre of wetland stores upwards of 1 million to 1.5 million gallons of water. It can process, evaporate, and treat that water. And it makes my job easier as a water manager if it's here. And if you allow development to happen and you replace it with something in Grand Rapids, I don't know what good it does yet. I mean, if you look at both the ecosystems, the eco-regions that they call, I had a lot of problems with those. And the wetland map, or the watershed maps, those are huge areas. Right?
Yep,
Well,
That's a
absolutely.
good
failure.
point counterpoint going on tonight, but I think Jim.
I can't help but think or wonder, how are these places, how do they fit into accounting? Is there
Into what?
accounting? It seems to me there would be plenty of opportunity to double count and double dip and
Well, there's,
this
no,
acre of wetland.
there is the potential for that, but they're tracked, the DEQ keeps really close track of, what acres are restored in a bank and how many credits are there. And then when someone impacts them, needs to buy a credit, it leaves this account and goes into that account and is tracked and documented. And the
Not
US,
too much scamming can be
I don't
done.
know.
It just seems to me that if it's a big wetland, somebody might buy it. It might be sold
So
3 or
we-
4 times, and
Yeah.
always, we got this land here.
So when the wetland's restored, there's a really intense, we hire these wetland biologists to go out and they delineate the boundary, which is amazing. You can really do it. I can almost do it at this point. I've done it enough with them, but that you can see the perimeter of it. They delineate it, and then they count how many acres of shrub, wooded, and emergent there are on that footprint. And that's what you have in your bank that's available to be transacted. It's kept track of at the DEQ or USDA. And then as you sell the credits off, they go from one place to the other to offset the impacts.
And then when you have 100 acres created, when you sell 100 acres,
You're done.
you can't sell any more in that area.
Nope, not on that site.
The only benefit that I see is when a farmer turns his cornfield back into a wetland. It was previously a wetland, now he's turned it back into a wetland. Is that once the easements are on it and it's in the bank, then it can never change. It's there forever. But I'm more of a purist. I think it should be a wetland to begin with. and
Well, there's no
not destroy
incentive.
another one.
When crop prices are good, there's no incentive for a farmer to go backwards.
That's right.
If they can keep it in production. With this program, there's a financial incentive to, if they change their, like you say, go to Florida and someone
There's
doesn't
some
want to farm.
pluses to it.
And then with what we're doing, you're doing public works projects. If you gotta widen the shoulder of the road for safety, you gotta widen the shoulder of the road. If that's impacting a wetland, you don't really have a lot of choices. So offsetting that impact through this means is better than not,
Yeah.
okay? And then the quality of the wetlands that we're restoring today is way better than the quality of the wetlands. The functions and values are way more sophisticated than they were when MDOT started doing them, like the ones along 127. So your point is well taken, I don't really disagree, but it has become a valuable way to stop fighting over some of the every square inches. And the ones that are really pristine, they're probably worth falling on your sword over. But the ones that are marginal, and that poor salamander, I'm sorry, but,
Yeah.
So what were the ones along 127, just pits?
more like borrow pits with,
Yeah.
so they're nice. I mean, it'd be kind of a nice thing to have in your,
Wetlands to begin with, they
Yeah.
tried to make a
Right.
wetland out of it. That's the velvet Elvis
Just a
argument.
whole, yeah.
yeah, and I don't disagree with you on that.
Yeah.
But some of the ones we've done, and like,
You go down and see the one down at Dansville, it's nice.
that one, that's a pretty amazing wetland.
Yeah.
And that's a very high functioning wetland, and it's got a great diversity of, this is waterfowl, but all the peripheral birds the shorebirds that go to these places is mind boggling. I mean, I kind of am a birder a little bit, but some of the ones that
Oh,
the really
absolutely.
sophisticated birders can see or note there is quite impressive.
There's one other argument I have with banking is they'll take the bank and they'll make the wetland rules and regulations from the boundary of that with a little bit of buffer. But wetlands aren't healthy unless they have really good upland ecosystems with them. And there's no consideration for rebuilding uplands next to these wetlands.
Another very good point, and I totally agree with you,
There you go.
because we don't get anything beyond the perimeter of the wetland.
That's right.
So on these private land sites, and our land, it is what it is, but on the private land sites, we only get credit to the fringe of the wetland. But we would really like to square it off with a buffer for just what Pat's talking
To build
about.
a total ecosystem, you can't just flood a farm field and say, wow, I have an ecosystem, so let's build houses on the rest of the farm field.
Absolutely
You
right.
have to have upland area and prairie mix and woods to make a wetland completely healthy, to be diversified in such a way that it becomes healthy, or it restores it back to before we changed it.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree.
How about a couple more questions, because we really have a full agenda, then I'll turn it over to Bill to chair the meeting. But you're welcome to stick around. I think Steve has offered to be a resource for our community as we move forward. And of course, Pat has always been a resource for us. I want to thank Kirk for inviting Steve.
Yeah.
And
Worked out.
Well, just to wrap.
Yeah.
My understanding of our current ordinance wouldn't allow an applicant to use an out-of-township bank at the moment. So if we wanted to open up to that possibility, we'd have to look into revising your.
Or even an off-site.
Even an off-site, that would also require an ordinance change. And our land preservation program has a different set of goals that would need to be rethought if some sort of use of those properties were to be considered. So we're several steps out from going in either of those directions, but now we've got some ideas that we can chew on to see what's the right way to go.
Sure.
Those sites, I think, could be what you're talking about, because some of them that were farms do have upland and lowland portions to them. So they might be good candidates, and we might look proactively at other folks who might be retiring. We had a farmer recently who wanted her land under a very strong easement and wasn't satisfied that any of the easements out there were as strong as she wanted them. But my guess is this
Might be the program for
the
it.
federal program might have met her needs, so.
And the other part of these, the 4 sites that we're doing on state game areas, they have sort of built into them on the tops of the low-head berms is a walkway path, you know, so that ends up being an amenity that, you know,
Mhm.
a lot of people enjoy.
Public access, yeah.
Right. Yes, sir.
Tying in with that, I think most of our land preserves have some wetland on them or past wetland on them.
Any property of any size has some.
Yeah, and just to counter Pat just a little bit, if we took your argument all the way, Pat, none of us should be living here.
Yeah, well, that Europeans ought to go back, you know, Columbus didn't do it.
We should all go back because, you know, put it back to the pristine when this was all a swamp. And
But I think the argument, Jim, isn't that we should go away,
Oh,
it's
no,
that we should
no.
be smarter developers. And
I totally agree
we
with
who
that.
write the rules for development and regulate it, like Steve and myself, and the government agencies and this agency, should be smarter about how they allow development to happen. And there's nothing natural about a Walmart's parking lot. I mean, come on. And there's nothing natural about a ditch that was man-made back in the 1910, 1890 or whatever. And the impacts on nature, because of those two things being put together, artificial ditch, like an artificially created wetland, and a parking lot, are just recipes for disaster long-term. So we can make it better. We can force the developers to do a better job at mitigating. And there's a lot of ways to do that and save them money. Everything doesn't have to be curb and gutter. Not all your roads have to have curbs either. You can do a lot of ecosystem management and water management by putting in roadside ditches that are water filters. And there's a variety of ways that you can manage your water so much better.
Well, I think a lot of the points, what resonates with me are the public works projects where you've got to widen the road or you've got, you know, impacts to wetlands for significant public purpose. The challenge, I think, is, at least with our wetland ordinance, is, you know, we've had a couple groups that have asked about mitigation, and it's just a hard pill to swallow to think that we would have a suburban shopping mall that's going to impact a high-quality wetland that should be mitigated somewhere much further away. But does the EPA have a site in Jackson? That was talked about recently.
There's a muck farm that was restored that's, I think, on the registry as a private mitigation bank site. So the
Okay.
EPA would have approved that, yes.
Okay. Yeah,
It's not theirs per se.
Okay.
But
there's a site that could be.
The DEQ, it goes through the DEQ and ultimately is approved by the EPA, but it ends up being a Michigan site. And I think there's a private bank site down by Jackson that I think was a muck farm. I've heard about that.
A muck farm?
Yeah. Like Pat was saying, onions and,
I'll tell you, the whole Ramey Chandler system just to the north of here,
yep.
that was a solid swamp. It was like the Everglades. And it's all student housing now and apartments and so on. And Ramey, it's called the Ramey Chandler system. And a man by the name of Ramey and a man by the name of Chandler, one was a senator and the other one was a developer. They put the ditches in, that whole system is man-made, dumps into the Looking Glass River, takes the north half of East Lansing out, and dumps it into the Looking Glass River, and that whole system was muck. And it was a beautiful wetland up there where Eagle Golf Course is, or whatever that place is
Hawk
called,
Hollow.
Soaring Eagle.
Hawk Hollow.
Or Hawk Hollow, whatever it is. I don't know golf course, so I don't know the names of golf courses. However, they used the water and they used the wet soils to create that beautiful golf course, as I've been on it and so on. But that used to be a absolutely premier migrating site, like the Maple River area used to be before then they dammed it up. But the Maple River used to flood, have these huge 10 miles of wetland communities in the spring for migrating ducks and geese and all kinds of waterfowl and swans and so on. None of that exists today. And the Ramey Chandler is all taken out of production. Right after Civil War, they hired the people that were no longer slaves, brought them up here, put them in huts, paid them a meager wage, and they, just like that picture with the dredger that he showed, that's how they dug those ditches. Cheap labor. And
We have time for a quick question.
Yeah.
Given the potential value that these properties are attracting in other communities, $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 an acre, $300,000. Is it potential that the county or the township could potentially attract some of these dollars to help restore some of our wetlands, even from development that's happening in Eaton County or Shiawassee?
So I guess the simple answer is yes, because you have the potential of becoming a wetland mitigation bank sponsor, taking a piece of your real estate, restoring the hydrology, and making the credits available to whoever you want to make them available to. We're under strict directive to, our credits are only to be sold to, for public works projects, county drain commissioners, road
Which makes
commissioners.
this program worth talking about.
What you're potentially saying is like what the private bankers are doing is that they sell them to whoever they want to sell them to, at whatever price they negotiate. And, if you are interested to look on the website, at the DEQ's website, there's a wetland mitigation bank registry. There's 25 bank sites on there currently. There's a whole bunch of new ones ever since came out of the doldrums of the economy. It's like all these new ones coming along, and they're scattered around. And I'm not making it up. They're 90 to 110,000 is what they're going for. And the drain commissioner in Southwest Michigan, she's selling them for 45, but she's selling them to her own sort of county
Internally to
agents.
the
Yeah,
county.
yeah.
Well, I've created over thousands and thousands of acres of wetlands that I've created, just me as drain commissioner. I refuse to put them in a bank because I think that a developer who's going to destroy a wetland should find a piece of highland to build on and not go into the wetland. And if I offered all the wetlands that I've created, which are over 5,000 acres, I'd have to count it again. It was 10, 15 years ago, it was 5,000 acres or more. If I offered that to the developing community,
They'd love you.
they'd love it. Right now, they don't like me much.
Well, as you can, your point is very well taken, Pat, but the thing is like for those developer guys, they want to keep on moving forward with their project. All of a sudden, they screech on the brakes because they got this wetland thing to deal with. If they can write a check, they'll write a big check to buy that credit and move on.
Sure. My argument would be that they should build around the wetland. They should treat the ecosystem with some building creativity. They should be a Leonardo da Vinci with their water movement, But they don't do that. They just look for straight roads, curb and gutter all the way, pipes. They don't look at any tenth of an acre wetland little things in the middle of their neighborhoods that they can save, and they don't look at it that way. And I think they should. I think they get bigger prices for their houses if they did that. Nobody wants to look out their back kitchen window into somebody else's kitchen window.
Right.
If they had wetland
Well, you would agree,
ecosystems in
I
back of
think,
the houses.
that they have changed, they've come a long ways.
I think they've come along a lot.
But there's ways to go, and to some degree, some of the criteria that they're held to for the development standard drives them towards some of those things. So that's, the other part.
Forsberg is a perfect example. Dennis Forsberg used to fight me tooth and nail. Now we're friends, and he comes to me and he says, how can I build this and not destroy anything?
There
Brett
you go.
Forsberg was in my office, he talks to me almost weekly now. And he wants to know how he can build it cheaper and not destroy the surroundings and have something where he can put a rentable space in the middle of an ecosystem that people would enjoy going to work every day and being around.
Right.
He's coming to our next green theme presentation next month.
You'll like what he's gonna show you.
That's
So one of
pretty-
the arguments that, or discussion points that often comes up during our wetland permit application process is to technically meet the criteria for a wetland under our ordinance is not all that difficult, because it's a long list of conditions and you only have to meet one. But oftentimes it's kind of obvious to everybody in the room that it's not what anybody would consider a high-quality wetland. And it's typically the applicant making that claim, right? So I think part of the interest is if there's a possibility for taking what could be a really high-quality site that was degraded in the past and reconditioning it, instead of working real hard to get a ditch next to a little road shoulder widening to have something more growing in it, that could be a net positive. So hopefully with you guys as partners, we can work towards
There's smart
taking
ways to
the
build things and
township
create ecosystems, and
forward.
sometimes you can take those marginal wetlands out of commission and swap them for something that's better. But they
Yeah.
should be close by, one, and it should be something that's historically been a wetland. Creating new wetlands out of highland is not very
Crazy.
productive.
Doesn't work.
They always fail.
always do.
They never work.
But that's also where the definition of watershed was interesting to me, because I mean,
That's
we're
right.
talking pretty locally, really. I mean, what do you define as kind of the largest, the appropriate size to consider when you're really talking about, you know, relatively local effects? I mean.
So they have these, they call them hydrologic unit codes, and there's different digit numbers associated with them, and the 8-digit is what's on my map.
Right.
But the 12s and the higher numbers get to where your smaller
Narrowed down
watersheds,
to the half
and
an
that's
acre
more
or
along the
whatever
lines of
we
what you're thinking. I mean, that's a totally legitimate thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the rules are the rules, I'm just trying to navigate it. you know?
Sure. Well,
I think
thanks so
Steve-
much for coming to present to us.
My
We
pleasure.
appreciate it.
Great guys doing.
Tell me everything I know about